March 15, 1945. 28,000 feet above the Austrian Alps, the morning sun painted the frozen canopy of Lieutenant Roscoe Brown's P-51 Mustang in shades of amber and gold. The thermometer in his cockpit read -40 degrees, yet sweat trickled down his spine beneath his flight suit. Below, the ancient city of Vienna sprawled across the Danube like a sleeping giant, unaware that the largest air armada ever assembled over Europe was bearing down upon it. 1,200 heavy bombers stretched across the horizon, in formations so vast they cast shadows that darkened entire valleys. The German High Command had assured their people that American bombers would never reach Austria's heartland. They believed that black men could never master the complexities of aerial combat. They were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how a group of pilots who were told they were inferior by their own country rose to become the most feared escort fighters in the European theater, shattering not only the German Air Force, but the very foundations of racial prejudice that had constrained them since birth. It is a tale of transformation, not just of the men who flew, but of an entire nation forced to confront its own contradictions in the skies over a crumbling empire. To understand the magnitude of what happened over Vienna that March morning, we must first travel back 4 years to a dusty airfield in the Alabama heat, where the impossible was being attempted for the first time. Tuskegee, Alabama, 1941. The red clay soil baked under a relentless July sun as a group of 13 young black men stood at attention on a freshly paved runway. They wore crisp Army Air Corps uniforms, but the pride in their eyes was tempered by the weight of knowing that nearly everyone in their own military expected them to fail. Captain Benjamin Oliver Davis, Jr. stood before them, his posture rigid, his voice steady. The son of the first black general in the United States Army, Davis had graduated from West Point 4 years earlier, where he had endured 4 years of complete silence from his white classmates. No one spoke to him, no one ate with him, no one acknowledged his existence except to give orders. Yet he had graduated 35th in a class of 276, his excellence undeniable even to those who despised him. "Gentlemen," Davis said, his words carrying across the humid air, "we are here to do what they say cannot be done. We are here to fly, we are here to fight, and we are here to prove that the color of a man's skin has nothing to do with his courage or his capability. Every eye in this country is upon us. Some are hoping we succeed. Most are waiting for us to fail. We will do neither. We will excel." The program that brought these men together had been born of contradiction. The Army Air Corps had long maintained that black men lacked the intelligence, reflexes, and emotional stability to pilot aircraft. Classified reports, dripping with pseudo-scientific racism, claimed that black Americans had smaller brains, slower reaction times, and insufficient courage for aerial combat. These reports were taken as fact by military leadership, used to justify the complete exclusion of black men from aviation. But pressure from civil rights organizations, black newspapers, and Eleanor Roosevelt herself had forced the military to establish an experiment. They called it an experiment because they expected it to fail. They would train black pilots at a segregated facility in Tuskegee, far from white airmen, using hand-me-down equipment and second-rate facilities. They would set the bar impossibly high, washing out candidates for infractions that would earn white pilots a warning. And when the black pilots inevitably failed, the military would have its proof that integration was impossible. What they did not anticipate was Chief Civilian Flight Instructor Charles Alfred Anderson. Anderson, known as Chief to everyone at Tuskegee, had taught himself to fly in 1929, when no flight school in America would accept a black student. He had purchased a used Valley monocoupe with borrowed money and studied the mechanics until he could take it apart and reassemble it blindfolded. He crashed twice during his self-taught training, walked away from the wreckage both times, and kept flying until he became one of the most skilled pilots on the East Coast. In 1941, when Eleanor Roosevelt visited Tuskegee to see the program for herself, her Secret Service detail had objected strenuously to her plan to fly with Chief Anderson. She ignored them completely, climbing into the rear seat of his Piper J3 Cub with a smile that the photographers captured for newspapers across the country. They flew for an hour over the Alabama countryside, and when they landed, she turned to the assembled press and said simply, "Well, he can certainly fly." That photograph changed everything. Funding increased, equipment improved, and the cadets training under Anderson began to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, they might have a chance. Among those first cadets was a young man from New York named Roscoe Brown. At 20 years old, Brown had already earned a degree in chemistry from Springfield College in Massachusetts. He had been a track star, a scholar, and a young man of relentless ambition. When he arrived at Tuskegee, he brought with him a quiet determination that his instructors immediately recognized. "Brown doesn't rattle," Anderson told Davis after watching the young pilot navigate a particularly difficult crosswind landing. "He thinks 3 moves ahead, that's rare." Brown's closest friend in the program was Lee Archer, a man whose journey to Tuskegee had been even more improbable. Archer had grown up in Harlem, the son of Caribbean immigrants who had instilled in him an unshakable belief in his own worth. He had attended New York University, worked as a clerk, and dreamed of flying since childhood. When he had watched barnstormers perform at a county fair and decided that one day he would join them in the clouds, the two men could not have been more different in temperament. Brown was methodical, analytical, approaching each flight as an equation to be solved. Archer was intuitive, almost artistic in the cockpit, feeling his way through maneuvers that Brown calculated. Yet they complemented each other perfectly, pushing one another to greater heights, their friendship forged in the crucible of shared struggle. The training was grueling beyond anything the cadets had anticipated. Primary training in the Stearman PT-17 biplane lasted 10 weeks, followed by basic training in the Vultee BT-13, then advanced training in the North American AT-6 Texan. Each phase washed out candidates ruthlessly. The instructors, both black and white, held the cadets to standards that exceeded those at white training facilities. A missed procedure, a sloppy maneuver, an attitude deemed insufficiently professional could end a cadet's dream overnight. Lieutenant Colonel Noel Parrish, the white commanding officer at Tuskegee, watched the washout rate with growing concern. He had come to the program skeptical but open-minded, and what he had witnessed over months of training had transformed his thinking completely. "These men are as capable as any I've trained," Parrish wrote in a memo to Army Air Corps leadership. "The washout rate reflects not their deficiencies, but the impossible standards we have imposed. We are squandering talent that our war effort desperately needs." His memos were largely ignored. The prejudice that had created Tuskegee was not interested in evidence. Yet, despite every obstacle, class after class of black pilots earned their wings. By the summer of 1943, the program had produced enough qualified fighter pilots to form the 332nd Fighter Group, with Davis as its commanding officer. They were deployed to North Africa, then to Italy, flying P-40 Warhawks that were already outdated by the time they arrived. Their first missions were frustrating. They flew patrols and ground attack sorties, chasing after targets that had already moved on, guarding harbors where enemy aircraft never appeared. The white bomber crews they were supposed to protect refused their escort, preferring to fly undefended rather than trust black pilots with their lives. The German Air Force, they were told, would eat them alive. Lieutenant Charles Dryden, one of the original Tuskegee graduates, wrote in his diary during those early months, "We are desperate for the chance to prove ourselves, yet every chance is denied. They send us to backwaters and expect us to rust. We will not rust. We will not break. We will wait for our moment, and when it comes, we will seize it." The moment came on July 2, 1943, over Sicily. 16 P-40s of the 99th Fighter Squadron were escorting bombers returning from a raid when German Focke-Wulf 190 fighters dove out of the sun. The German pilots expected easy prey. What they found was a squadron that had trained relentlessly for precisely this moment. Captain Charles Hall spotted them first. "Bandits, 2 o'clock high," he called over the radio. "Breaking right." The formation exploded into action. Hall pulled his P-40 into a climbing turn that bled speed, but gave him a firing angle on the lead German fighter. His 650 caliber machine guns roared. The German aircraft shuddered, trailing smoke, then spiraled toward the Mediterranean. It was the first confirmed aerial victory by a Tuskegee airman. But the significance went far beyond a single downed aircraft. Word spread through the bomber community that the black pilots had held their own against the Luftwaffe's best. Requests for their escort began to trickle in. The trickle became a stream. By the spring of 1944, the Tuskegee pilots had transitioned to P-51 Mustangs, the finest propeller-driven fighter of the conflict. The P-51 was a revelation. Its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine produced over 1,400 horsepower. Its range allowed it to escort bombers all the way to targets deep in enemy territory and back. Its speed and maneuverability made it a match for any German aircraft in the sky. Colonel Davis insisted that his pilots paint the tails of their Mustangs a distinctive red, making them instantly recognizable. The color was not chosen randomly. Red was bold. Red was impossible to miss. Red declared to bomber crews and enemy fighters alike that the 332nd had arrived. "If we are going to fight," Davis told his pilots, "then let them know who they are fighting. Let there be no confusion, no excuses, no claims that someone else did what we did." The red tails became a symbol. Bomber crews who had once refused their escort now specifically requested them. The Tuskegee pilots were developing a reputation that defied everything the military had believed about them. And it was this reputation that brought Roscoe Brown to the skies over Vienna on that cold March morning in 1945. The mission briefing had begun at 0400 hours in a frigid Quonset hut at their base in Ramitelli, Italy. 66 pilots sat on wooden benches, their breath visible in the cold air, as the intelligence officer outlined the target. The Daimler-Benz tank factory in the Floridsdorf district of Vienna. The factory produced engines for the Panther tank, one of the most formidable armored vehicles in the German arsenal. Its destruction would cripple enemy armored production for months. The bombers assigned to the mission were B-17 Flying Fortresses of the 15th Air Force. 1,200 of them would participate, requiring fuel and ordnance that strained logistical capabilities to their limits. The escort would be provided by multiple fighter groups, with the 332nd assigned to the most dangerous phase, the final approach and withdrawal over the target itself. "Expect heavy resistance," the intelligence officer warned. "The Germans have pulled fighters from across their remaining territory to defend Vienna. Photo reconnaissance shows new aircraft on fields throughout Austria. They're throwing everything they have left at us." Davis stood at the end of the briefing, his face unreadable. "Gentlemen," he said, "the bombers must reach the target. They must drop their ordnance and they must return home. That is our only priority. Stay with them. Do not break formation to chase personal glory. The bombers are what matter. Am I clear?" 66 voices responded as one. "Yes, sir." Roscoe Brown climbed into his P-51, serial number 44769, at 0630. He had named the aircraft Bunny after his girlfriend back home. Her photograph was taped to his instrument panel, a reminder of what he was fighting to return to. He ran through his pre-flight checks methodically, every switch and gauge confirmed, every control surface tested. In the P-51, a missed checklist item could mean death. The engine caught on the first try, the Merlin's distinctive rumble vibrating through the airframe. Brown taxied to the runway, lined up with his flight and waited for the green flare that would signal takeoff. When it came, he pushed the throttle forward, felt the surge of acceleration press him back into his seat, and lifted into the Italian dawn. The rendezvous with the bombers occurred over the Adriatic Sea at 22,000 feet. Brown had seen large formations before, but nothing like this. The B-17 stretched across the sky in groups of 6, each group stacked above and behind the next, the entire armada covering miles of airspace. The contrails from their engines merged into a white river that pointed directly at the heart of Austria. "Red flight, this is Red Leader," Davis's voice came over the radio. "Take position above lead group. Brown, you're on my wing." Brown clicked his microphone twice in acknowledgement and eased his Mustang into position. At 28,000 feet, the cold was brutal. His flight suit and heated gloves helped, but his feet were numb within an hour. He flexed his fingers constantly, keeping the blood flowing, keeping his hands ready for the controls. The Alps passed below, their peaks impossibly white against the blue sky. Brown had never seen mountains like this, had never imagined such beauty could exist in a world torn apart by conflict. For a moment, he allowed himself to marvel at the sight, to appreciate that whatever happened next, he had flown higher and farther than anyone had ever believed a man like him could go. Then Vienna appeared on the horizon, and the beauty vanished. The flak came first. Anti-aircraft batteries surrounding the city opened up with a barrage that turned the sky black with bursting shells. Each explosion sent shrapnel slicing through the formation, tearing into wings and fuselages, turning bombers into fireballs that tumbled toward Earth, trailing smoke and flame. Brown watched 3 B-17s go down in the first minute, their crews bailing out when they could, riding the silk down into enemy territory where capture was the best they could hope for. "Hold formation," Davis commanded. "Eyes on the bombers." Then the German fighters arrived. They came from above, diving through the formation with a speed and aggression that took Brown's breath away. These were not the second-line pilots the Tuskegee men had faced in previous months. These were elite interceptors flying Messerschmitt 262 jets, the most advanced aircraft in the world. The jets moved like nothing Brown had ever seen, their twin turbojet engines pushing them to speeds that made his Mustang feel like it was standing still. The 262 had entered service only months before, and it represented a technological leap that could have changed the course of the air conflict had it come earlier. It could outrun any propeller-driven fighter by nearly 100 miles per hour. Its 4 30mm cannons could shred a bomber with a single burst. And its pilots, drawn from the Luftwaffe's remaining veterans, knew exactly how to use it. "Jets! Jets at 12 o'clock high!" someone shouted over the radio. Brown saw them, 3 262s streaking toward the lead bomber group. Their swept wings and shark-like fuselages, unlike any aircraft he had encountered. They were moving so fast that by the time he registered their presence, they had already passed through the formation, their cannons blazing. A B-17 exploded directly in front of him, the blast wave buffeting his Mustang, debris pinging off his canopy. Break right, Davis ordered. "Do not let them make a second pass." Brown rolled his P-51 into a steep turn, pulling so many gravitational forces that his vision narrowed to a tunnel. The pressure suit squeezed his legs and abdomen, forcing blood back to his brain, keeping him conscious. He saw one of the jets below him pulling up from its attack run, beginning to climb for another pass. The textbook said you could not catch a 262 in a Mustang. The textbook said to stay with the bombers and hope the jets ran out of fuel. The textbooks did not account for Roscoe Brown. He had studied the 262's weaknesses obsessively, poring over intelligence reports and pilot debriefs. The jet engines were powerful but temperamental. They responded slowly to throttle changes, which meant the 262 was vulnerable in transitions, in the moments between attack runs, when it had to slow down to maneuver and then speed up again. If you could catch one in that window, you had a chance. Brown pushed his throttle to full military power and dove after the jet. His airspeed indicator climbed past 400 miles per hour, past 450, past 500. The airframe shuddered as he approached the Mustang's limits, the controls growing heavy and unresponsive as compressibility effects took hold. He was entering a realm where a wrong move would tear the wings off his aircraft or send him into an unrecoverable spin. But he could see the jet ahead of him now, see it clearly as it climbed and slowed, its pilot confident that no propeller-driven fighter could catch him. Brown was closing the distance, 300 yards, 200, 150. He put his gun sight on the jet's fuselage, led it slightly to account for its movement, and squeezed the trigger. 6 streams of .50 caliber tracers reached out across the sky. The first burst missed, passing behind the jet. Brown adjusted, walked the tracers forward, and saw them find their target. Pieces flew off the 262's wing. Smoke began to stream from one of its engines. The jet rolled, tried to dive away, but Brown followed it down, firing again and again until flames erupted from the fuselage, and the German pilot ejected, his parachute blossoming white against the Austrian countryside. "Splash 1 jet," Brown called, his voice cracking with adrenaline. "262 is down." He had just accomplished what was thought to be nearly impossible. He had caught and downed a jet fighter in a propeller-driven aircraft, and he was not the only one. Across the sky, the pilots of the 332nd, were engaging the German interceptors with a ferocity and skill that the Luftwaffe had never encountered from American escorts. Lieutenant Charles Brantley downed a Tu-62 with a deflection shot that would be studied in flight schools for decades. Lieutenant Earl Lane caught one attempting to flee and put rounds into its cockpit. The jets that had seemed so invincible minutes before were falling from the sky. The German formation began to break up. Pilots who had expected easy prey found themselves hunted. The discipline that had characterized their attack dissolved into individual survival. One by one, the remaining jets turned for home. Their revolutionary technology no match for the determination of men who had been told all their lives that they could not fly. The bombers reached the target. 1,200 tons of ordnance fell on the Daimler-Benz factory, reducing it to rubble and flame. The Panther tank program would never recover, and as the formation turned for home, not a single bomber under the escort of the 332nd had been lost to enemy fighters. Not one. Word of what had happened over Vienna spread through the 15th Air Force within hours. Bomber crews who had survived the mission told anyone who would listen about the red-tailed Mustangs that had driven off the jets, that had stayed with them through the flak and the fire, that had brought them home. The reputation that the Tuskegee Airmen had been building for months crystallized into legend in a single day. But the story of the Vienna mission is not just a story of combat. It is a story of what happened inside the minds of men who discovered that everything they had been taught about themselves and others was false. And to understand that transformation, we must look at what was happening not only in the cockpits of the American fighters, but in the headquarters and living quarters of the German forces who faced them. General Adolf Galland was the commander of Germany's fighter forces in 1945, and he was a man who had seen his certainties crumble one by one over 4 years of conflict. He had been among the first to recognize the potential of the jet fighter, had championed the Tu-62 when others in the high command wanted to use it as a bomber, and had staked his reputation on the belief that this revolutionary aircraft could turn the tide of the air conflict. The reports from Vienna reached him that evening, and they were not what he had expected. "How many jets lost?" he asked his aide. "3 confirmed, possibly a 4th. Galland set down the report. "To whom?" The aide hesitated. "The American escort. The group with the red tails." Galland knew of the red tails. He had read the intelligence assessments that described them as an all-black fighter group, a curiosity that the reports had assured him was of no real military significance. The assessments had speculated that the Americans were using these pilots for morale purposes, deploying them in secondary roles where they could not cause harm to the war effort on either side. The assessments had been wrong. "Find out everything about this group," Galland ordered. "Who they are, where they trained, how they fight. I want to know why they are different." It was not a question that the German military apparatus was equipped to answer. The ideology that underpinned the German war effort was built on assumptions of racial hierarchy, of inherent superiority and inferiority determined by blood. The pilots of the 332nd did not fit into this framework. Their existence, their excellence, was not merely a military problem for Galland. It was an ideological impossibility. And yet there they were, in the gun camera footage that arrived from the surviving jets, in the reports of bomber crews and ground observers, in the inescapable evidence that men who were supposed to be inferior had outflown, outfought, and outthought the best pilots Germany could put in the air. The reports made their way through the chain of command, accumulating analyses and annotations as they rose. By the time they reached the highest levels, they had been sanitized, the most disturbing implications removed. The leadership was not interested in evidence that contradicted their worldview. They wanted explanations that preserved it. But for the men who had actually faced the red tails in combat, no sanitized report could change what they had experienced. They had seen the truth at 500 miles per hour, had felt it in the tracers that found their aircraft, had understood it in the moments before they bailed out over their own territory. The black pilots were not inferior. They were not inadequate. They were exceptional. Lieutenant Franz Stiegler had survived the Vienna mission by diving away from a red-tailed Mustang that had latched onto his Tu-62 with a tenacity he had never experienced. He had pushed his jet to its limits, had felt the airframe shudder with the strain, and had escaped only because his fuel had lasted just long enough to reach a forward airfield. When he climbed out of his cockpit, his hands were shaking. "They fight differently, Hugh," he told his squadron mates that night. "They stay with the bombers. They do not chase us for personal victories. They protect. It makes them predictable in one sense, but it also means they are always where they need to be. We cannot draw them away. We cannot find gaps in their coverage. They are disciplined in a way I have not seen from the Americans before." He did not mention what the intelligence reports had said about the pilots he had faced. He did not mention that according to the ideology he had been taught, they should not have been able to fly at all. He did not need to. Everyone in the room understood. Back at Ramitelli, the celebration was subdued. The Tuskegee pilots had learned not to celebrate too loudly, not to give anyone a reason to accuse them of arrogance or impropriety. They gathered in their quarters after the debriefing, sharing details of the mission, reliving moments that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Roscoe Brown sat apart for a while, the enormity of what he had done slowly settling into his consciousness. He had shot down a jet, the most advanced aircraft in the world, brought down by a kid from New York whose own country had told him he was not smart enough to fly. Lee Archer sat down beside him. "That was something," Archer said quietly. "Yeah." Brown stared at his hands, still feeling the vibration of the trigger. "I keep thinking about what they said back in the States, that we didn't have the reflexes, that we couldn't handle the pressure. And then today I watched you and Brantley and Lane do things that most pilots will never do, things they said we couldn't do." Archer nodded slowly. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe we were never going to get to show them unless they put us somewhere we could prove them wrong. They gave us the Mustangs. They gave us the mission, and we showed them. But they didn't want to give us any of it. They wanted us to fail. I know. That's what makes it matter more." Brown looked at his friend, at this man who had grown up in Harlem, dreaming of the sky, and had somehow, against all odds, found his way into it. "What do we do now when this is over?" Archer smiled slightly. "We make sure nobody forgets. We make sure that the next kid who wants to fly doesn't have to go through what we went through. That's what this was always about, Roscoe. Not just winning the missions, winning the argument, proving that they were wrong about us, about all of us." Colonel Davis entered the quarters and the pilots rose to attention. He waved them down, his expression thoughtful. "Gentlemen," he said, "I received a communication from 15th Air Force Headquarters this evening. The bomber groups are submitting formal commendations for our escort today. They are requesting that the 332nd be assigned to their most critical missions for the remainder of operations." He let that sink in. For months, the Tuskegee pilots had struggled for recognition, had faced skepticism and hostility from the very forces they were trying to protect. Now those forces were asking for them by name. "I want you to understand what this means," Davis continued. "This is not about us. This is about every black man and woman who has been told they are not good enough, not smart enough, not brave enough to serve their country as an equal. Today you proved that was a lie. Not with words, not with arguments, with actions that cannot be denied or explained away. You did this. Remember it." He turned and left, and the quarters remained silent for a long moment. Then slowly the pilots began to talk again, to laugh, to release the tension of the day. They were young men far from home who had just accomplished something remarkable, and they needed to feel that, to let it become real. But beneath the conversation, beneath the relief and the pride, there was something else, an awareness that what they had done was not just a victory in a combat zone thousands of miles from home. It was a blow against a system that had constrained them since birth, a system that existed in their own country, as surely as it existed in the ideology of the enemy they were fighting. They had proven that they could fly. They had proven that they could fight. Now they would have to prove that their country could change. The March 15th mission over Vienna was not the end of the 332nd story. It was a turning point, a moment when the accumulation of evidence became impossible to ignore. Over the remaining weeks of the conflict, the Tuskegee Airmen flew escort missions that cemented their reputation as the finest fighter group in the European theater. They escorted bombers to Berlin, to Munich, to targets that represented the final destruction of the German capacity to make conflict. They faced dwindling opposition as fuel shortages grounded more and more enemy aircraft, and experienced pilots were lost faster than they could be replaced. But when they did face opposition, they handled it with the same discipline and skill that had defined them over Vienna. By the time Germany surrendered in May of 1945, the 332nd Fighter Group had compiled a record that spoke for itself. They had completed 1,500 missions in the European theater. They had destroyed or damaged over 260 enemy aircraft. They had sunk a destroyer with machine gun fire alone. And they had never lost a bomber to enemy fighters while under their escort. Never. Not one. No other fighter group in the 15th Air Force could make that claim. No other fighter group had even come close. The men who had been sent to Tuskegee as an experiment in expected failure had become the standard against which all other escort fighters would be measured. But the numbers, as impressive as they were, told only part of the story. The deeper transformation was happening, not in the statistics but in the minds of the men who had fought alongside the Tuskegee pilots and the men who had fought against them. Captain Robert Johnson was a white bomber pilot who had flown with the Tuskegee escort on 4 missions, including the March 15th Vienna raid. He had grown up in rural Georgia, raised with the casual racism that pervaded every aspect of Southern life. He had come to the Army Air Corps with assumptions about black Americans that he had never questioned because he had never had reason to question them. The missions changed him. "I did not want them," he admitted years later. "When we were told we would be escorted by the black fighter group, I was not happy about it. I thought we would be left unprotected. I thought they would not know what they were doing. I was wrong about everything." He described watching the red-tailed Mustangs over Vienna, seeing them engage the jets with a fury and precision that he had not witnessed from any other escort. He described the moment when a 262 had made a run at his bomber and a Tuskegee pilot had cut it off, driving it away with a burst that sent the jet trailing smoke toward the ground. "That pilot saved my life," Johnson said. "He saved the lives of my entire crew, and I realized that I had been carrying around ideas about people that were not just wrong, but stupid. Dangerously stupid. These men were better than me. They were better than most pilots I had ever flown with, and I had almost refused to fly with them because of the color of their skin." He was not alone in his transformation. Across the 15th Air Force, in the bomber groups and fighter groups and support units, the evidence of the Tuskegee Airmen's excellence was forcing men to confront their prejudices. Not all of them changed. Racism does not surrender easily. But enough of them changed that something shifted in the military's understanding of what was possible. And on the other side of the lines, the transformation was even more profound. The German forces who faced the 332nd in the final months of conflict were men whose entire worldview was built on assumptions of racial hierarchy. They had been taught that they were the master race, that their enemies were inferior, that victory was their destiny because of who they were by blood. The pilots of the 332nd disproved all of this in the most direct way possible. Franz Stiegler, the jet pilot who had barely escaped over Vienna, was among those captured in the final weeks of the conflict. During his interrogation, he was asked about the enemy fighters he had faced. He described the red tails without hesitation. "They were the best," he said, "disciplined, skilled. They did not make mistakes. We were told they were inferior because of their race. We were told many things that were not true." It was a remarkable admission from a man who had spent years immersed in an ideology of racial superiority. The evidence of his own experience had overridden what he had been taught. He had seen the truth in combat, and it had changed what he believed. This was the real victory of the Tuskegee Airmen, not just the missions completed or the aircraft downed, but the assumptions shattered. They had proven their excellence in a domain where excellence could not be denied or explained away. They had shown that the theories of racial inferiority were not just morally wrong, but factually wrong, and they had shown it in front of witnesses who could not pretend they had not seen it. The implications would take years to fully unfold. But as the Tuskegee pilots prepared to return home in the summer of 1945, they carried with them the knowledge that they had changed something fundamental. They had not just served their country, they had challenged it, and they had won. The summer of 1945 brought victory in Europe, but for the men of the 332nd Fighter Group, the return home was not the triumph they had earned. They sailed back across the Atlantic as heroes in Europe, decorated and celebrated, their record unmatched by any fighter group in the theater. But as their ship approached the coast of Virginia, a different reality began to assert itself. Lieutenant Robert Dees stood at the rail as the American shoreline came into view, watching the green hills and white buildings grow larger on the horizon. He had been dreaming of this moment for 2 years, had imagined the homecoming, the parades, the recognition that surely must await men who had done what they had done. But as the ship entered Hampton Roads and he saw the separate facilities for white and colored personnel clearly marked on the docks, he felt something cold settle in his chest. "We saved their bombers," he said quietly to the pilot standing beside him. "We faced their jets. We brought their boys home. And we come back to this." The pilot, a young lieutenant from Chicago named William Campbell, said nothing. There was nothing to say. They had known this was waiting for them. They had always known. But knowing and experiencing were different things, and the experience was bitter in ways that knowledge could not prepare them for. The disembarkation was segregated. The white troops walked down one gangway to waiting buses that would take them to celebrations with their families. The black troops walked down another gangway to waiting buses that would take them to a separate facility, where they would wait for transportation to wherever they were going next. No families were there to greet them, no reporters, no acknowledgement that anything remarkable had occurred. Colonel Davis was the last of the 332nd to leave the ship. He walked down the gangway with his spine straight and his face unreadable, the same posture he had maintained through 4 years at West Point, when no one would speak to him. He had learned long ago that dignity was something you carried inside yourself, that no one could take it from you unless you let them. But even Davis, with all his discipline, felt the weight of this moment. A white officer was waiting at the bottom of the gangway with a clipboard. He glanced at Davis's eagles, at his ribbons, at the distinguished flying cross and the silver star that marked him as one of the most decorated pilots in the Army Air Forces. "Colonel Davis," the officer said, checking his clipboard, "your men are to report to Camp Patrick Henry for processing. Colored facilities are on the south side of the base. Transportation is waiting." Davis looked at the officer for a long moment. "My men just completed 1,500 combat missions in the European theater," he said evenly. "They have the finest escort record of any fighter group in the 15th Air Force. Is there nothing else you wish to say to them?" The officer shifted uncomfortably. "I have my orders, Colonel. The buses are waiting." Davis nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "the buses are always waiting." He walked to where his men were assembled and addressed them briefly. "Gentlemen, we have returned home. We will conduct ourselves with the same discipline and professionalism that we displayed in combat. We will give no one cause to criticize us. We will remember what we have accomplished even if others choose to forget." Dismissed. The men boarded the buses in silence. They drove through the Virginia countryside, past towns where German prisoners of war were being served in restaurants that would not seat a black American in uniform. They saw the signs that marked facilities for white and colored, the same signs they had grown up with, the same signs that had told them all their lives that they were less than, that they did not belong, that their country was not really their country. Roscoe Brown sat in the back of the bus, watching the America he had fought for roll past the window. He thought about the mission over Vienna, about the 262 in his gun sight, about the moment he had proven that everything they said about him was wrong. He thought about the bomber pilots who had thanked him personally, who had shaken his hand and told him that he had saved their lives. He thought about the recognition he had received in Italy, the respect from men who had seen what he could do. And he thought about the officer with the clipboard who had looked at Colonel Davis like he was a problem to be processed. "It is not going to be enough," Brown said quietly. Lee Archer, sitting beside him, turned. "What?" "What we did over there. The missions, the record, all of it. It is not going to be enough to change this." Brown gestured at the window, at the segregated landscape passing by. "They are not going to look at what we accomplished and decide that they were wrong about us. They are going to find ways to explain it away, to minimize it, to pretend it did not happen. Because if they admit what we did, they have to admit what they did to us. and they do not want to do that." Archer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Maybe, but they cannot unfly those missions. They cannot give back those bombers we saved. They cannot erase the fact that we shot down their jets. The record exists. The evidence exists. And every time they try to pretend it does not, we will be there to remind them. For how long? How long do we have to keep reminding them?" "As long as it takes." Archer's voice was steady. "We did not go through all of that to give up now. We did not prove we could fly just to accept that we cannot walk through the same door as a white man. This is the next mission, and we are going to complete it the same way we completed the others, by being so good they cannot ignore us." The bus continued through the Virginia countryside, carrying men who had saved their country to a place where their country still refused to accept them. It was a contradiction that would define the next chapter of their lives and the next chapter of American history. The months following their return were a study in frustration. The Tuskegee Airmen were celebrated in the black press, their achievements documented and praised in newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender. They were invited to speak at black churches and community centers, where audiences listened with pride and wonder to the stories of what they had accomplished. But in the white mainstream, they were largely invisible. The major newspapers carried little about them. The newsreels that played before movies in theaters across the country did not show their faces. The national narrative of victory in Europe had little room for black heroes. It was as if they had never existed. Captain Charles McGee, who had flown 136 missions in Europe and would go on to fly over 400 missions across 3 conflicts, spoke about this erasure in terms that captured the experience of many Tuskegee veterans. "We came home expecting that things would be different," he said. "We thought that what we had done would matter, that people would see us differently because of it. But America was not ready to see us. America was not ready to admit that everything it had believed about us was wrong. So they looked away. They pretended that the red tails had never flown." The men dispersed across the country, returning to communities where their service meant little to the white power structures that controlled their lives. They applied for jobs and were told that no positions were available. They tried to use GI Bill benefits to purchase homes and were denied loans. They sought admission to colleges and universities and were rejected or steered toward black institutions with limited resources. The country they had served was not prepared to serve them in return. But the Tuskegee Airmen were not men who accepted limitations. They had spent their entire lives being told what they could not do, and they had responded by doing it anyway. They brought the same determination to civilian life that they had brought to combat. Roscoe Brown enrolled at New York University, earning a doctorate in education. He would go on to become president of Bronx Community College, transforming an institution that served predominantly minority students into a model of academic excellence. He spent decades fighting for educational equity, bringing to that fight the same precision and determination he had brought to the skies over Vienna. Lee Archer became a corporate executive, one of the first black Americans to reach senior positions in major companies. He broke barriers in the business world as decisively as he had broken them in combat, opening doors for those who came after him. Charles McGee stayed in the newly independent Air Force, flying in Korea and Vietnam, accumulating one of the most remarkable combat records in American military history. He would eventually be promoted to the rank of Brigadier General, a recognition that came decades after his service, but was no less meaningful for the delay. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. became the first black general in the United States Air Force, commanding units around the world, shattering barriers at every step. His career was a sustained argument against everything that the military establishment had believed about black officers, an argument made not with words, but with results that could not be disputed. These individual achievements were significant, but they were not the full measure of what the Tuskegee Airmen accomplished. Their real legacy was not in the careers they built, but in the change they helped bring about in the institution that had tried to exclude them. In 1947, the Army commissioned a study to examine the performance of black troops during the conflict. The study, known as the Gillum Board Report, examined the evidence and reached a conclusion that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Black soldiers had performed as well as white soldiers in combat, and the segregation of the military was inefficient and harmful to national defense. The Gillam Board did not call for full integration. The prejudices of the era were too strong for that. But it recommended steps toward greater inclusion, toward the recognition that the military could not afford to waste the talent of black Americans. It was a crack in the wall of segregation, small but significant. The crack widened the following year. In July of 1948, President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9981, declaring that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. It was the beginning of the end of military segregation, and the Tuskegee Airmen had made it possible. Truman's order did not cite the 332nd Fighter Group by name. It did not need to. Everyone who understood the history knew that the record of the Tuskegee Airmen had provided the evidence that made integration undeniable. They had proven under the most demanding conditions imaginable that black Americans could perform at the highest levels of military aviation. They had done it so thoroughly, so consistently, so brilliantly, that the arguments against integration had collapsed under the weight of their achievement. The integration of the military was not instant or easy. Resistance came from commanders and units throughout the services. Some bases in the South maintained unofficial segregation for years after the executive order, but the direction was set and the momentum was irreversible. Within a decade, the armed forces of the United States were fully integrated, a transformation that made them one of the most integrated institutions in American society. This transformation rippled outward. Black veterans who had served in integrated units came home with different expectations. They had worked alongside white Americans as equals, had proven themselves in combat and in technical roles that civilian society still denied them. They were not willing to accept the old limitations. They became leaders in the civil rights movement, bringing military discipline and organizational skills to the struggle for equality. The legal battles that dismantled segregation in the 1950s and 60s were fought by lawyers and activists, but they were supported by evidence that the Tuskegee Airmen had helped create. When the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that segregated schools were unconstitutional, the justices were not thinking specifically about fighter pilots, but the intellectual foundation of their ruling, the recognition that segregation was based on false assumptions of inferiority, had been reinforced by the record of black military excellence in the recent conflict. The Tuskegee Airmen had not won the civil rights movement. That victory belonged to the millions who marched and organized and sacrificed over decades, but they had provided proof of concept. They had shown that integration worked, that black Americans could excel in any endeavor when given the opportunity, that the assumptions underlying segregation were not just morally wrong, but factually wrong. They had demonstrated this not in a courtroom or a legislative chamber, but in the skies over Europe, where the evidence was written in aircraft downed and bombers saved and missions completed. And they had demonstrated something else as well, something that mattered beyond the policy debates and legal arguments. They had demonstrated dignity. The men of the 332nd had faced hostility from their own military, had been denied opportunities and recognition, had returned home to a country that refused to accept them as equals. They had every reason to become bitter, to abandon the institutions that had treated them so poorly. Instead, they had excelled. They had maintained their discipline and their professionalism. They had proven their worth not by demanding to be treated as equals, but by performing as superiors. This was not accommodation or acceptance of injustice. It was a strategy of irrefutable excellence, a determination to make the evidence so overwhelming that denial became impossible. It was a way of fighting that suited men who had learned to fight against impossible odds and win. Colonel Davis articulated this philosophy near the end of his career, looking back on what the Tuskegee Airmen had accomplished. "We were fighting for the right to fight," he said. "We were proving that we deserved the chance to serve our country by serving it better than anyone expected. We could not control how we were treated. We could only control how we performed, and we performed in a way that spoke for itself." The record spoke loudly enough that eventually the country had to listen. The full recognition of the Tuskegee Airmen took decades to arrive. For years after the conflict, Their achievements were largely forgotten by mainstream American culture. Histories of the air war in Europe mentioned them briefly, if at all. The narrative of American aviation heroism was dominated by white faces, white names, white units. But the Tuskegee Airmen did not disappear. They organized. They told their stories. They connected with younger generations who were hungry to know the full history of Black American achievement. And slowly, the recognition began to come. In 1995, the 50th anniversary of the end of the conflict, the surviving Tuskegee Airmen were invited to a ceremony at the Air Force Academy. They walked among the cadets, these old men who had once been young pilots, and they saw faces of every color looking back at them. The Air Force they had integrated was now drawing its leadership from every community in America. In 2007, the remaining Tuskegee Airmen were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor that Congress can bestow. 300 of them traveled to Washington for the ceremony, white-haired men in their 80s and 90s, wearing their old uniforms and decorations. They gathered in the Capitol Rotunda, surrounded by the symbols of a nation that had once rejected them and now celebrated them. President George W. Bush presented the medal with words that acknowledged both the achievement and the injustice. "You helped win a conflict, and you helped change our nation for the better," he said. "And the medal that we confer today means that we are doing a small part to make that long journey to justice a little shorter for those that are coming up." Roscoe Brown was there that day, 84 years old, still straight-backed and sharp-eyed. He had spent 4 decades as an educator after the conflict, had earned his doctorate and led institutions of higher learning, had continued the fight for equality in classrooms and boardrooms across America. But he still remembered the mission over Vienna. He still remembered the jet in his gun sight. He still remembered the moment when he had proven that everything they had said about him was wrong. When asked what the medal meant to him, he was characteristically direct. "It means that the country has finally caught up to where we were 60 years ago," he said. "We knew what we could do. We knew what we had accomplished. We did not need a medal to tell us, but it is good that the country knows now. It is good that the children will learn the real history, not the one that left us out." Lee Archer had passed away 3 years before the ceremony, but his family accepted the medal on his behalf. His son spoke of a father who had never complained about the obstacles he had faced, who had simply kept achieving and kept opening doors. "He used to say that the best revenge was success," his son recalled. He did not want to get even with the people who had doubted him. He wanted to exceed them. And he did. Again and again, he did. Charles McGee, 97 years old, was there in his dress uniform, his chest covered with ribbons from 3 conflicts. He had flown more combat missions than almost any pilot in American history. He had been denied promotion for decades because of his race and had never stopped serving. "The medal is beautiful," he said, holding the heavy gold disc in his hands. "But the real reward was the service. The real reward was proving that we belonged. Every mission was a chance to show them what we could do, and we showed them." The ceremony was covered by every major news outlet in the country. For the first time, the Tuskegee Airmen were part of the mainstream American story. Not a footnote or an afterthought, but a central chapter. Their faces appeared on magazine covers and television screens. Their names were spoken by anchors who had never heard them before. The 60-year delay in recognition made the recognition itself more powerful when it finally came. But recognition was not the end of the story. The Tuskegee Airmen had always been about more than recognition. They had been about change, and the change they had helped bring about continued to unfold. In 2008, 1 year after the Congressional Gold Medal ceremony, the United States elected its first black president. Barack Obama was not a direct descendant of the Tuskegee Airmen, but his achievement was built on the foundation they had laid. The integration of the military that they had made possible had helped create an integrated society where a black candidate could be taken seriously, could win votes from every community, could stand as a symbol of what America could become. Obama met with the surviving Tuskegee Airmen during his campaign, and again after his inauguration. He spoke of what they meant to him personally, as a black American who had grown up with the inspiration of their story, and what they meant to the country, as proof that excellence could overcome prejudice. These gentlemen showed that courage is not about the absence of fear, Obama said. It is about deciding that something else is more important than fear. They decided that proving their worth was more important than their safety, that opening doors for others was more important than their comfort. They flew into danger so that we could walk through those doors they opened. We owe them everything. The president invited several Tuskegee Airmen to be part of his honor guard at his inauguration. They stood near the podium as he took the oath of office, old men in their uniforms, witnesses to a moment they had helped make possible. Roscoe Brown was not in the honor guard, but he watched from the crowd, and he wept. "I never thought I would see this," he said afterward. "When I was growing up, when I was training at Tuskegee, when I was flying those missions, I never thought America would elect a black president. I hoped we would get there someday, but I did not think I would live to see it. And now here it is. Here he is. And I know that what we did mattered. I know that we were part of making this happen." The connection between the Tuskegee Airmen and the broader arc of American history was not metaphorical. It was direct and traceable. The men who had proven that black Americans could fly had helped create a country where black Americans could do anything. But the story does not end with recognition and triumph. The story ends where all stories end, with the passage of time and the fading of those who lived it. The Tuskegee Airmen are nearly gone now. The last of the original pilots are in their late 90s, and every year there are fewer. The men who flew over Vienna, who proved the impossible over the skies of Europe, are passing into history, becoming names in books and faces in photographs. Roscoe Brown passed away in 2016 at the age of 94. He had spent his final years giving speeches about the Tuskegee experience, visiting schools and military bases, making sure that the story would be remembered. His last speech was at the Air Force Academy, where he stood before cadets who would go on to fly jets he could not have imagined, and told them about the P-51 Mustang he had flown over Vienna. "You have opportunities we never had," he told them. "You have technology we never dreamed of. But you also have something we gave you. You have the proof that anyone can fly. You have the evidence that excellence has no color. We gave you that. Do not forget it. Do not let anyone forget it." Charles McGee passed away in 2022 at the age of 102, the last of the original Tuskegee pilots. He had continued flying until he was well into his 90s, had continued speaking and inspiring, had continued embodying the spirit of the Red Tails until the very end. In his final interview, he was asked what he wanted his legacy to be. "I want young people to know that they can do anything," he said. "I want them to know that obstacles are not permanent, that barriers are meant to be broken. We broke the barriers in the sky. Now they have to break the barriers wherever they find them. That is the mission. The mission is never over." The Tuskegee Airmen are passing into history, but history is not the same as forgetting. History is how we remember, how we teach, how we carry the lessons of the past into the future, and the lessons of the Tuskegee Airmen are still being learned. In 2020, the United States Air Force announced that one of its training bases would be renamed in honor of General Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. The base had previously been named for a Confederate officer. Now it would bear the name of a man who had proven that courage and excellence have nothing to do with the color of skin. The renaming was symbolic, but symbols matter. They tell us who we were and who we want to be. In 2021, the remains of several Tuskegee Airmen who had been lost in training accidents during the conflict were finally identified using modern forensic technology. They were buried with full military honors, their sacrifice recognized nearly 80 years after their deaths. The ceremonies were small, but they were attended by families who had waited generations to lay their loved ones to rest. The country was still catching up to what the Tuskegee Airmen had done. And in flight schools across America, young men and women of every background learned to fly in a tradition that the Tuskegee Airmen made possible. They learned the same maneuvers, the same disciplines, the same respect for the aircraft and the mission. They learn that flying is not about who you are, but about what you can do. They learn, whether they know the history or not, that they are heirs to a legacy of excellence that was forged in the face of hatred and doubt. This is the true legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen, not the medals or the ceremonies, Not the numbers of aircraft downed or missions flown, but the change they wrought in the minds of men. They took a lie that had been believed for centuries, and they disproved it so thoroughly that it could never be fully reassembled. They opened the skies to everyone who came after them. General Daniel James Jr., who became the first black four-star general in American military history, spoke of what the Tuskegee Airmen meant to his own career. James had been too young to fly in the conflict, but he had grown up watching the Red Tails, dreaming of the day when he could join them. He had flown fighters in Korea and Vietnam, had risen through the ranks on merit and determination, had broken barrier after barrier, because the Tuskegee Airmen had shown that the barriers could be broken. "They made me possible," James said simply. "They made all of us possible. Before them, a black pilot was a contradiction in terms. After them, a black pilot was just a pilot. That is what they did. They made us normal. They made us American." The transformation extended beyond the military, beyond aviation, beyond any single institution or field. The Tuskegee Airmen had contributed to a fundamental shift in how America understood itself. They had demonstrated that the country's professed ideals of equality and opportunity could be made real, that the gap between what America said and what America did could be closed. They had shown that change was possible, that excellence could overcome prejudice, that the arc of history could bend toward justice if enough people were willing to push it. This was the answer to the question that Roscoe Brown had asked on that bus in Virginia in 1945, when he had wondered whether what they had accomplished would ever be enough to change the country they had served. The answer was yes. It was not fast. It was not easy. It was not complete even now, decades later. But it was yes. What they had done mattered. It mattered for the military, and for the nation, and for every person who came after them. They had taken to the skies because no one would let them prove themselves on the ground. They had faced the enemy's best and defeated them. They had protected the bombers and brought them home. And in doing so, they had changed what was possible for everyone who followed. On March 15, 1945, high above the city of Vienna, Lieutenant Roscoe Brown had put his gun sight on a jet aircraft and pulled the trigger. In that moment, he had accomplished something that the world had said could not be done. He had shot down the most advanced aircraft in the sky while flying a plane powered by a propeller. He had proven that skill and determination and courage mattered more than technology or ideology or the color of skin. It was one moment, in one mission, in one conflict. But it was also so much more. It was a refutation of everything that had been used to hold black Americans back for centuries. It was proof that the lies were lies, that the barriers were artificial, that the sky was open to anyone with the will to reach it. The German leadership that day received reports of what had happened over Vienna. They learned that their jets had been defeated by pilots they had been told were inferior. They learned that their assumptions were wrong. Some of them adjusted their beliefs. Others clung to their ideology until the end, unable to accept evidence that contradicted everything they had built their lives upon. But the evidence did not care whether they accepted it. The evidence existed. The jets were down. The bombers were home. The Red Tails had prevailed. And in that prevailing, they had changed the world. The Tuskegee Airmen returned to America and found that their country was not ready for them. They faced discrimination and denial and erasure. But they did not stop. They kept flying, kept achieving, kept proving. They became doctors and lawyers and executives and generals. They raised families and built communities and mentored young people who had never heard of Tuskegee. They lived their lives as evidence that excellence was possible, that barriers could be broken, that change would come. They were right. Change came. Slowly, painfully, incompletely, but it came. The military integrated. The society transformed. The opportunities expanded. The children and grandchildren of the Tuskegee Airmen grew up in an America that was different from the one their fathers and grandfathers had known. Not perfect, not equal, but different, better, closer to the ideals it professed. This is the story of the Tuskegee Airmen. It is a story of combat and courage, of missions flown and records set, but it is also a story of transformation, of a nation forced to confront its contradictions, of men who proved that what they had been told about themselves was wrong, and in doing so helped prove that what America had been told about itself was wrong as well. They showed that the color of a man's skin had nothing to do with his ability to fly. They showed it so clearly, so undeniably, that the evidence could not be ignored or explained away. And in showing it, they helped create a world where a young person of any background can look at the sky and know that it is open to them. That is the legacy of the Red Tails. That is what they accomplished over Vienna and over all of Europe and over all the years that followed. They opened the sky. They proved what was possible. They changed what America could become. Roscoe Brown, in one of his last speeches before his death, was asked what he would say to young people who were facing obstacles in their own lives. He thought for a moment, this old man who had once been a young pilot over Austria, and then he smiled. "I would tell them that the obstacles are real," he said. "I would tell them that the doubt and the discrimination and the people who say they cannot do it are real. But I would also tell them that they are not permanent. They are not facts of nature. They are things that men have built, and things that men have built can be torn down. We tore them down. We tore them down at 30,000 feet over Vienna. We tore them down every time we flew a mission and came home, and if we could do it then, they can do it now. The sky is open. It is open to everyone. We made sure of that. The sky is open. It is open because of what happened over Vienna on March 15th, 1945, and because of everything that came before and after. It is open because a group of men who were told they could not fly refused to accept that judgment and proved it wrong. It is open because they excelled so completely that the arguments against them collapsed. It is open because they would not give up, would not give in, would not stop until the country that had rejected them was forced to accept them. The Tuskegee Airmen proved that the sky belongs to anyone with the courage to reach for it. And in proving it, they changed what America could be. That is their story. That is their triumph. That is their gift to everyone who comes after them. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.